My name is Dr. Elias Vance. I am 73 years old. And for the last 25 of those years, I have lived with a secret that has been a constant, low-frequency hum beneath the surface of my life. It's a silence that is louder than any noise, a weight I've carried from a place that officially, for all intents and purposes, was nothing more than a glorified university project in the middle of nowhere. I was one of the lead radio frequency engineers on the initial construction and calibration of the high-frequency active auroral research program, Haarp. You've probably heard of it. The place in Gakona, Alaska, that forest of aluminum trees. The public story, the one they fed to Congress and the press, was that it was all about studying the ionosphere. Benign, academic, a bit boring even. A way to understand space weather, improve communications, things like that. That was a lie. Or to be more precise, it was an infinitesimally small part of the truth. It was a cover story. A brilliant one, because it was just plausible enough. That public mission, that was phase one. It was my job to make sure it worked perfectly, to establish a baseline, to prove the concept. But the real reason for its existence, the reason for the obscene budget and the DARPA oversight and the quiet involvement of Air Force intelligence, that was phase two. Phase two was my project, my design, my theory, and my catastrophe. We weren't there to study the weather. We were there to talk to something. And the great, cosmic, soul-shattering tragedy of it all is that it answered. Before we go any further, before I take you back to the ice and the hum of the capacitors, I need you to do something. If you are here because you look for the stories hidden between the lines of official reports, if you believe that not all questions have been answered, then make sure you are subscribed to this channel. Turn on the notifications, because what I am about to tell you is not something they ever wanted you to hear. And let me know in the comments right now, a simple yes or no. Do you believe there are truths so profound, so dangerous, that a government is right to hide them forever? Think about that. Now, let me tell you what we really built in the Alaskan wilderness. It all started not with a bang, but with a blueprint. A stack of them, actually, nearly 2 feet high, sitting on my desk at a nondescript consulting firm in Virginia that did most of its work for the Department of Defense. This was back in the early 1990s. The Cold War was officially over, but the institutions it created were still there, humming along, looking for new dragons to slay. My specialty was, and is, exotic wave propagation. I knew how to make signals do things they weren't supposed to do. Bend them, bounce them, squeeze them through impossible apertures. I'd spent my career working on projects that never made the news. Over-the-horizon radar, submarine communication systems that used the planet's own magnetic field. I was a tool, a very specialized, very well-paid tool for men who thought in terms of strategic advantage. The Haarp proposal that landed on my desk was different. On the surface, it was about ionospheric heating, pumping energy into the upper atmosphere to create a temporary artificial lens, then studying the effects. But buried deep in the technical appendices, under layers of impenetrable mathematics, was the real goal. Project designation, Aeneas. The objective was stated in the dry, bloodless language of the Pentagon: to establish a methodology for coherent, structured, non-terrestrial signal exchange. They wanted to talk to something that wasn't on Earth, but they weren't aiming for the stars. The math didn't point out, towards space. It pointed up, directly up, into the thin, electrically charged shell that separates our world from the void. The theory, my theory, which had caught their attention from a paper I'd published years earlier, was that the ionosphere wasn't just a passive layer of gas. I hypothesized that under the right conditions, with the right application of immense, precisely controlled energy, it could behave like a neural network, a vast planetary-scale brain, not a living one, not in a biological sense, but a medium so complex, so sensitive to electromagnetic flux, that it could achieve a state of awareness. They gave me everything I asked for. The budget was a black hole. Money just vanished into it without a trace. The location, Gakona, was chosen for its magnetic isolation. Far from the noisy chatter of civilization, a place where you could listen to the sky without interruption. I remember the first time I flew up there. It was on a cramped little de Havilland Twin Otter, the kind of plane held together with duct tape and prayers. We flew out of Anchorage, over mountains that looked like broken teeth, vast and white and utterly indifferent to human existence. The pilot was a grizzled old-timer named Mac, a man whose face was a road map of burst blood vessels and frostbite scars. He knew the land. He didn't say much for the first hour, just wrestled with the controls as the wind tried to tear us out of the sky. Then, as we flew over the Copper River Valley, he pointed down. "See that?" he grunted over the engine roar. "They call it the Gakona Anomaly." Down below, the endless expanse of black spruce and white snow was weird. It wasn't anything you could pinpoint immediately, just a feeling, a wrongness. "The lights," he said, not looking at me. "Sometimes at night they're not green and flowy like the regular aurora. They're sharp, geometric, like someone's drawing lines up there. The Atna elders, they have stories. Say the sky has a spirit. A cold one. Doesn't like being woken up." I smiled, the smug, patronizing smile of a man with a PhD in physics. "Atmospheric plasma discharges," I said. "Probably interacting with mineral deposits in the mountains. Creates unusual light patterns." Mac just grunted again. "Sure, Doc. Minerals. You see a light that makes a perfect square in the sky? You come tell me about minerals." He was quiet for another 10 minutes. Then he said something that stuck with me. Something I'd remember years later in a room filled with screaming men. "Thing about this land," he said, his voice low. "It's old. Real old. People come up here thinking they can tame it, put their stamp on it. They build their roads, their pipelines, their fancy antenna farms. But the land, it doesn't care. It just waits. It was here long before us, and it'll be here long after we're just a layer of dust. You gotta be careful what you shout into the dark up here. You might not like the echo you get back." At the time, I dismissed it as local folklore, the ramblings of an unscientific mind. My mind was full of Fourier transforms and plasma physics. I was a man of science, of repeatable experiments and observable data. I was there to build a transmitter, the most powerful one in human history. I had no idea that Mac was wrong. We weren't building a transmitter. We were building a megaphone to shout at a god. And we weren't just going to get an echo. We were going to get a reply. The construction site was a controlled chaos of mud, steel, and human effort. For 18 months, it was my entire world. I lived in a prefabricated trailer that shook every time a heavy truck rumbled past, and the taste of coffee and diesel was my constant companion. The air itself felt different in Gakona. It was thin and sharp, so cold it felt like breathing in microscopic needles of ice. But there was a clarity to it, a purity that made the sky seem impossibly close. And the silence. When the generators were off and the construction crews had gone home for the day, the silence was a physical presence. It was so profound you could feel it pressing in on you. It wasn't an absence of sound. It was the presence of an immense, waiting quiet. We were a strange collection of people, a little island of high-tech ambition in the middle of a primordial wilderness. We had roughneck construction crews who could weld a perfect seam in a 30-below blizzard, and we had physicists like me, who spent our days in heated rooms arguing about wave-particle duality. The team for Phase 2 was small, hand-picked. There was me, the architect of the signal. There was Dr. Eris Thorne, a brilliant but perpetually worried physicist from Caltech. Eris was my conscience, my intellectual sparring partner. Where I saw possibility, he saw risk. He was the one who would constantly ask, "But what if we're wrong, Elias? What if the model doesn't account for everything?" Then there were the technicians, young, bright kids fresh out of MIT and Stanford, their eyes wide with the scale of what we were building. And overseeing it all, the ever-present, quietly menacing figure of Major Davis from the Air Force. Davis wasn't a scientist. He was a manager of secrets. He spoke in acronyms and classified protocols. His job was not to understand what we were doing, but to ensure that no one else did. The array itself grew day by day, a forest of identical aluminum crosses rising from the cleared ground. 180 of them in total, each 72 feet tall, arranged in a perfect grid. To a layman, it looked like a bizarre, oversized radio station. To me, it was the most sensitive instrument ever conceived. Each antenna was a neuron. Together, they formed a brain. And I was the one writing the thoughts it would think. I remember the day of the first full-array power-up test. It was late autumn, and the first serious snow had fallen, blanketing the world in a pristine, sound-dampening layer of white. The sky was a low, heavy gray. We were all gathered in the control center, a concrete bunker packed to the ceiling with humming server racks and glowing monitors. The air was thick with tension and the smell of hot electronics. This was still part of Phase 1, the public-facing mission. The goal was simple: energize a small patch of the ionosphere 300 kilometers up and measure the result. A proof of concept. "Initiating power sequence," a technician called out, her voice tight. I watched the main power displays, the numbers climbing steadily. Gigawatts of power being drawn from the dedicated natural gas power plant we'd built on site. You could feel it through the soles of your shoes, a low, deep thrum that resonated in your bones. The entire facility was vibrating like a massive tuning fork that had just been struck. "Array is hot," I said, my own voice calm, betraying none of the frantic energy I felt inside. "Targeting designated coordinates. Let's send up the first pulse. Standard ionosphere sweep. Keep it simple." The technician typed in the commands. A single sharp click echoed in the room. On the main screen, a visualization showed the energy leaving the array, a focused beam of radio frequency energy shooting straight up into the gray sky. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Just the hum of the machines and the quiet beeping of the sensors. Eris was standing next to me, his arms crossed, chewing on his lower lip. "Anything?" he murmured. "Patience, Eris," I said. "The signal takes time to travel." Then, it came. The return signal. On the spectrum analyzer, a line spiked exactly where we expected it. The ionosphere had reflected our pulse just like a mirror. A wave of relief washed over the room. People clapped, someone let out a whoop. It worked. The machine did what it was designed to do. But I wasn't looking at the main spike. I was looking at something else. A faint, almost imperceptible ghost on the display. A secondary echo. And a third. They were weak, buried in the noise. But they were there. And they weren't harmonic artifacts. They were phase-shifted, structured. It was like we'd thrown a rock into a pond and the main splash had come back. But then a moment later, a series of tiny, perfectly organized ripples had returned from a different direction. "What is that?" Eris whispered, pointing at the screen. I didn't have an answer. "Signal reflection from a different atmospheric layer, maybe," I said. But I didn't believe it. The math was wrong for that. It was something else. That night, I couldn't sleep. The hum from the array seemed to have seeped into the walls of my trailer. I kept rerunning the data in my head. The ghost signals. They weren't random. There was a relationship between them, a mathematical elegance that had no business being there. It was the first sign, the first whisper back from the sky. We had set out to create an artificial lens in the atmosphere, but we had inadvertently nudged something that was already there, something that had its own structure, its own rules, and it had noticed us. The official log for that day reads, "First power-up test successful. All systems nominal." But I knew, in that deep, intuitive part of a scientist's brain where real discovery happens, that nothing was nominal. We had knocked on a door we didn't even know existed, and in the profound silence of the Alaskan night, I had the distinct, chilling feeling that something on the other side was starting to wake up. The next few months were a strange dance between two realities. In the daytime, we were the respectable face of Haarp, Phase 1. We ran our experiments for the public record, publishing papers on artificial airglow and ELF VLF wave generation. We dutifully heated our patches of sky, took our measurements, and fed the data to the university consortiums who were our public partners. We were, to all outside appearances, a group of dedicated, slightly boring atmospheric physicists. But at night, the real work began. Phase 2, Project Aeneas. The control center would go into lockdown. The encrypted satellite link to Fort Meade would activate. Major Davis would be there, a silent, watchful presence in the corner. His presence a constant reminder of the stakes. Our team, the core Aeneas group, would take over, and we would talk to the ghosts in the machine. Those faint, structured echoes we detected on the first day became our obsession. We spent weeks just listening. We'd send up simple pulses, pings, and sweeps, and carefully, meticulously record the replies. It was like trying to understand a language with no Rosetta Stone. The replies weren't sounds or words. They were complex returns of electromagnetic energy, full of intricate patterns, phase shifts, and mathematical relationships that were beautiful and terrifyingly complex. Eris and I would argue for hours, scrawling equations on whiteboards until they were covered in a chaotic web of symbols. He was convinced we were just observing a new, complex natural phenomenon. "It's a resonant feedback loop, Elias," he'd insist, his face flushed with passion. "The ionosphere is a non-linear medium. We put energy in. It creates unforeseen complexities. We're just seeing the system's own internal dynamics. It's not a signal. It's just a very, very complicated echo." "An echo doesn't rearrange itself in response to our input," I'd shoot back. "Look at the data from last night. We sent up a simple sine wave. The reply came back as a perfect fractal. It's not just reflecting, Eris. It's processing. It's taking our signal, analyzing it, and sending back something more complex. That's not a feedback loop. That's a conversation." The real breakthrough came on a Tuesday night in February. The temperature outside was 42 below zero, and the air was so still you could hear the ice crystals forming on the windows. We had been working on a new type of pulse, something I had designed based on a hunch. It wasn't about power. It was about complexity. I called it the resonance key. It was a cascading sequence of extremely low frequencies, modulated in a way that mimicked the neural firing patterns of the human brain. The theory was that if the ionosphere was acting like a network, we needed to talk to it in a language it understood, the language of interconnected nodes. It was a long shot, a wild, intuitive leap. "This is madness, Elias," Eris said, looking at the waveform on my screen. "This isn't RF engineering. This is voodoo. You're trying to play a symphony on an instrument we don't even know how to hold." "Maybe it's not an instrument we hold, Eris," I replied. "Maybe it's one we dance with." Major Davis just watched us from his corner, his expression unreadable. For him, this wasn't about science. It was about results. We fired the resonance key. The sequence was only 10 seconds long, a quiet, intricate pulse of energy that was barely detectable compared to our usual brute force transmissions. For a full minute, there was nothing. Just the hiss of the receivers. The hopeful energy in the room began to drain away. One of the technicians sighed. Aris gave me a look that said, "I told you so." And then it happened. It wasn't a spike on the spectrum analyzer. It was a wave. A slow, powerful, impossibly pure sine wave that bloomed across every single sensor at once. It wasn't an echo. It didn't come from a specific point in the sky. It came from everywhere. The entire ionosphere, for a radius of hundreds of miles around us, was vibrating, singing. It was resonating on a single, perfect frequency. A frequency that was the precise mathematical root of the complex sequence we had sent. No one spoke. We just stared at the screens. The hum in the room seemed to fade away, replaced by the imaginary sound of that perfect celestial note. We had done it. We had found the right key. The sky wasn't just reflecting our signal anymore. It was answering in its own voice. We weren't bouncing signals off a dead layer of gas. We were in a dialogue with a consciousness that existed within the very fabric of the upper atmosphere. In the corner, Major Davis finally moved. He walked over to the console, his eyes fixed on the pure, unwavering line on the display. He didn't look at me. He looked at the screen, as if it were a captured enemy. "Good work, Doctor," he said, his voice a low growl. "Now, teach it how to talk." That moment, that should have been the greatest triumph of my life, was the moment the dread truly began to set in. Looking at the cold, predatory gleam in Davis's eyes, I understood. For me, this was about discovery, about making the single greatest leap in the history of science. For him and the men he worked for, this wasn't about making a friend. It was about harnessing a new kind of power. We had just made contact with something ancient, vast, and utterly alien. And the first thing my species wanted to know was how to turn it into a weapon. The perfect sine wave held for 3 minutes and 15 seconds, then faded away, leaving a silence in the room that was heavier and more terrifying than it had been before. The success of the resonance key changed everything. The project's focus narrowed with a terrifying intensity. Major Davis was suddenly much more involved, his phone calls with shadowy figures at the Pentagon more frequent. The pretense of Phase 1 was still maintained for the outside world, but within the concrete walls of the control center, we were now single-mindedly focused on one goal: communication. How do you talk to a mind the size of a planet? A consciousness made of plasma and magnetic fields? It doesn't have a mouth. It doesn't have ears. Its only sensory organ is the electromagnetic spectrum, and its only voice is the same. We had its attention. Now we had to say something meaningful. The debates were endless. Should we send images? Music? We tried. We translated a simple photograph of a circle into a binary radio signal. The reply was a chaotic burst of static, as if the concept was meaningless or offensive. We transmitted the first few bars of a Bach concerto, encoded in frequency shifts. The response was a deep, low-frequency rumble that vibrated the entire facility, a sound that felt like a celestial groan of annoyance. "We're thinking about this all wrong," I said one night, after another failed attempt. We were in the small, cluttered conference room, the whiteboard a mess of failed ideas. Aris was pacing, his hands deep in his pockets. "We're trying to send it human concepts, things tied to our senses, sight, sound. It doesn't have eyes or ears. It has no context for a picture or a song. We need a language that is truly universal, something that exists outside of biology and culture." "Mathematics," Aris said, stopping his pacing. the language of the universe. It was the obvious answer, the only answer. But what mathematical concept was simple enough to be a greeting, yet complex enough to unambiguously signal intelligence? Pi, one of the young technicians suggested. Too complex as a starting point, I countered. It's an irrational number. It would look like noise. We went back and forth for hours. Finally, we settled on the most fundamental, elegant, and undeniably artificial concept we could think of. The prime number sequence: 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, and so on. There's nothing in nature that produces prime numbers. They are a pure, abstract product of intelligence. It was perfect. It was a simple, unambiguous way of saying, we are here, and we can think. It took us a week to design the transmission. We couldn't just send the numbers. We had to encode them. We represented each number as a series of short, distinct pulses. 1 pulse, then a pause. 2 pulses, then a pause. 3 pulses. 5. We would send the first 100 prime numbers, a clear, unmistakable beacon of intelligent thought. I should have listened to Eris. He was uneasy. All week he was quiet, withdrawn. The night of the transmission, he cornered me by the coffee machine. His face was pale, his eyes dark with worry. "Elias, we shouldn't do this," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We don't know what this thing is. We don't know how it thinks. We're treating it like a computer, assuming it processes logic. What if it doesn't? What if it processes something else? Sensation? Emotion?" "That's why we're using primes, Eris," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "It's pure logic. There's no emotion in the number 7. It's a clean, sterile signal. It's the safest thing we can send." He shook his head slowly. "There's no such thing as a safe shout in the dark. To you, it's a beautiful, logical sequence. To a dog, a high-frequency whistle is just agonizing pain. We're about to whistle at a god, Elias, and we have no idea what it will hear." But I was arrogant. I was high on the verge of discovery. Major Davis was breathing down my neck. The entire weight of Project Aeneas was on my shoulders. I saw the finish line. I ignored the warning signs. That night, the control room was buzzing with a nervous electric energy. We ran through the final checks. The sky was clear, and a faint, natural aurora danced on the horizon, a placid green curtain. It felt like the calm before a storm. "All systems go," the lead technician announced. "Encoder is ready. Array is slave to the signal." I took a deep breath. "Initiate transmission." I looked over at Eris. He was standing by the far wall, his face ashen. He wouldn't look at me. The first pulse went out, then the second set, the third, the fifth. One by one, our message of pure logic climbed into the heavens. The entire transmission took just under 2 minutes. And then, we waited. For 30 seconds, there was only the familiar hiss of the receivers. I felt a pang of disappointment. Maybe it hadn't understood. Maybe it was just a complicated echo after all. And then the reply came. It wasn't a signal. It wasn't a pattern of energy on a screen. It was a wave of pure, weaponized emotion that slammed into the facility with the force of a physical blow. The first thing that hit was terror. Not the kind of fear you feel when you're in danger. This was an abstract, philosophical terror. A sudden, crippling, existential dread that stripped away all meaning from the universe. It was the feeling of being a tiny, insignificant insect under the gaze of an ancient, impossibly vast, and utterly malevolent intelligence. It was the knowledge of your own complete and utter irrelevance. It hit us all at once. The room erupted in chaos. One of the young technicians, a brilliant kid from Caltech, simply fell out of his chair and started weeping, curling into a fetal position on the floor. Another one began screaming, a high, thin animal sound of pure panic, and started clawing at the monitor in front of him, trying to dig his way out of reality. Major Davis, the hardened soldier, the man of secrets, stumbled backwards, his face a mask of white shock, his hand fumbling for the pistol on his hip as if he could shoot the feeling that was invading his mind. I was gripping the edge of the console, my knuckles white, a cold pressure building behind my eyes. The feeling was indescribable. It was the concentrated despair of 1 billion dying stars, the cold loneliness of empty space, the raw, neurological horror of a brain that knows it is nothing but a temporary chemical reaction. We had sent it a mathematical concept, and it hadn't sent math back. It had sent us the feeling of what it was like to be an ancient cosmic being, annoyed by the persistent, meaningless chatter of insects. The sky outside the reinforced windows was no longer black. It had turned a color I have no words for. It was a sickening, bruised, violent shade of purple-black, a color that seemed to absorb all light and hope. It churned and boiled, and for a horrifying second, I thought I saw a shape in it. A vast, geometric shape, like a multifaceted eye the size of a continent, staring down at us with cold, analytical hatred. We hadn't made a friend. We hadn't opened a dialogue. We had just thrown a rock at a sleeping titan. And we had just found out, in the most brutal way imaginable, that it was awake. The wave of pure terror lasted for 93 seconds. It felt like an eternity. It felt like the entire lifespan of the universe compressed into a moment of perfect, soul-crushing horror. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was gone. The pressure in my head vanished. The crippling dread receded, leaving behind a hollow, trembling emptiness. The screaming in the control room subsided into ragged sobs and whimpers. The sky outside faded from that impossible, bruised purple back to the familiar black of the Arctic night. The silence that fell was more profound than any I had ever experienced. It was the silence of a battlefield after the fighting stops. It was filled with the ghosts of the screams and the residue of the fear. I let go of the console. My hands were shaking so violently I had to clench them into fists. I looked around the room. It was a scene of utter devastation, but without a single thing out of place. One technician was still curled under his desk, rocking back and forth, muttering something about the angles over and over again. Another was staring blankly at his screen, tears streaming down his face, a thin trickle of blood coming from his nose. Eris was leaning against the far wall, his face buried in his hands. He was shaking, but he was on his feet. Major Davis was on the floor, propped up against a server rack. He had managed to draw his sidearm, and it lay on the floor a few feet from his outstretched hand. His eyes were wide, staring at the ceiling, seeing something that wasn't there. His face, usually a mask of stern control, was slack with a terror so deep it looked like it had aged him 20 years. I was the first to speak. My voice was a dry, cracking whisper. "Damage report," I croaked. It was an absurd thing to say. The damage wasn't to the equipment. It was to us. To our minds. The lead technician, a tough, capable woman named Sarah, slowly pushed herself up in her chair. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and took a shaky breath. All systems are green," she said, her voice trembling. "Power is stable. Array is quiescent." We had done this. I had done this. My beautiful, elegant theory. My resonance key. My perfect prime number sequence. I had taken all of that scientific ambition and used it to inflict a form of torture we didn't even have a name for on my own team. The weight of that guilt was a physical thing, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I walked over to Eris. He looked up at me. And his eyes. I will never forget the look in his eyes. It was a mixture of terror, pity, and a terrible damning vindication. "You see now, Elias," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You see what you've done? It wasn't a conversation. It was a challenge. We sent it a puzzle and it replied by showing us the futility of all puzzles, the futility of everything." Before I could answer, the red phone on Major Davis's secure console began to ring. It was a sound that was both jarring and, in a strange way, inevitable. The outside world was knocking. No one moved to answer it. The ringing seemed to go on forever, a shrill, demanding shriek in the traumatized silence. Finally, Davis stirred. He seemed to pull himself back from whatever abyss he had been staring into. He crawled over to the console, pulled himself up, and snatched the receiver. "Davis," he said. His voice was unsteady, a pale imitation of his usual commanding tone. He listened for a moment, his face growing paler, if that was even possible. "Yes, sir," he said. Then, "No, sir. An unexpected atmospheric event. A severe geomagnetic storm." A lie. The first brick in the wall of the cover-up being laid right there in front of us. He listened again. "Yes, sir. The team is shaken, but no physical casualties. The facility is secure." He paused. "Understood." He hung up the phone with a slow, deliberate movement. He turned to look at all of us, his eyes sweeping across the room, lingering for a moment on the men who were still incapacitated by fear. His professional mask was back in place, but it was cracked. You could see the raw terror still swimming behind his eyes. "No one leaves this room," he said, his voice hard, brittle. "No one makes any outside contact. The log entries for the last hour will be erased. The official story is that we were hit by a solar flare of unprecedented magnitude. That is the only story. Anyone who says otherwise will be engaging in an act of treason. Do you understand me?" No one answered. We just stared at him. Treason. He was already burying it, burying what we had seen, what we had felt. He walked over to me, his steps unsteady but determined. He stood right in front of me, his gaze intense. "Doctor," he said, his voice low so only I could hear. "What you have done here tonight? You have opened a box. My superiors will want to know if you can close it. More importantly, they'll want to know if you can open it again. And this time, aim it at someone else." The horror of his words washed over me, a second wave that was colder and sharper than the first. They didn't see a catastrophe. They saw a demonstration, a successful test of a new form of weapon. A weapon that didn't break bodies, but shattered minds. A weapon that could induce terror on a mass scale. In that moment, I realized the true nature of the monster we were facing. It wasn't just the ancient, unknowable consciousness in the sky. It was also the cold, calculating ambition of the men I worked for. And I was trapped between them. The project was over. My project, the project of scientific discovery, was dead. Something else was about to begin. Something much, much worse. The sun began to rise a few hours later, casting a weak gray light over the snow-covered landscape. But it brought no warmth, no comfort. We all just sat there, in the silent, humming control room, prisoners of our own discovery, waiting for the helicopters to arrive. We knew they were coming. The men who clean up messes like this. The men who enforce the silence. Project Aeneas was finished. The cover-up was just beginning. The takeover was swift, silent, and brutally efficient. Just before dawn, 2 unmarked black Sikorsky helicopters descended on the facility, their rotors beating the cold air into a frenzy. They didn't land at the helipad. They landed right in the middle of the antenna field, a clear and deliberate show of force. Doors slid open and men in black tactical gear, armed with assault rifles and wearing no insignia, poured out. They moved with a chilling, practiced synchronicity, securing the perimeter, the control center, and our living quarters before any of us had a chance to fully process what was happening. They weren't soldiers, not in the way I understood them. They were something else. Spooks. Cleaners. The kind of men who exist in the shadows of the national security state. Major Davis met their commander, a tall, gaunt man with dead eyes and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. They spoke for a few moments in low, urgent tones. Then Davis came back into the control room. His authority had been completely stripped away. He was just another piece on the board now, same as the rest of us. Pack your personal belongings. Nothing else. No notes. No drives. No data. You have 10 minutes, the gaunt man said. His voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. It was the voice of a man who was used to giving orders that were not questioned. My team, what was left of it, was herded out of the control center. The two technicians who had been the most affected were taken away separately. I never saw them again. I don't know what happened to them. I was escorted back to my trailer by two of the black-clad operators. They stood in the doorway, their rifles held at a low ready, while I threw a few clothes and books into a duffel bag. My eyes kept darting to my personal laptop, sitting on my small desk. It contained all of my private research notes, my theoretical models, the entire intellectual history of Project Aeneas. It was my life's work. I made a move towards it, and one of the operators took a half step forward, his hand tightening on his weapon. The message was clear. That part of my life was over. They took us, one by one, to the facility's small, windowless infirmary for a debriefing. It wasn't a debriefing. It was an interrogation. I sat at a cold metal table across from the gaunt man and a woman in a severe gray suit who introduced herself only as a liaison from Washington. A tape recorder sat between us. "Tell us what happened, Dr. Vance," the man said. So I told them. I tried to explain the resonance key, the prime number sequence, the nature of the reply. I tried to convey the cosmic scale of what we had encountered. They listened without interruption, their faces impassive. When I got to the part about the emotional wave, the weaponized terror, the woman in the suit held up a hand. "Let me be clear, Doctor," she said, her voice like chipping ice. "You experienced a severe psychological breakdown induced by a combination of isolation, stress, and a freak geomagnetic event. Your team suffered from a form of mass hysteria. This is the official finding. This is the reality you will be living with from now on." "That's not what happened," I said, my voice rising. "The sky changed color. We were attacked." The gaunt man leaned forward, his dead eyes locking onto mine. "Dr. Vance," he said softly, and the softness was more menacing than any shout. "Let me tell you what happened. You and your team were engaged in highly classified atmospheric research. You served your country with distinction. However, the project has been deemed unstable. It's being reverted to its original public-facing mandate. Your involvement is concluded. You will be reassigned. You will sign a new non-disclosure agreement, one with significantly more teeth than your previous one. You will never speak of Project Aeneas, the resonance key, or any of your theories about a consciousness in the sky to anyone. Not your family, not your friends, not any future colleagues. As far as the world is concerned, it never happened. You can't just bury this," I pleaded. "This is the greatest discovery in human history. It has to be studied, understood, safely." "It will be studied," the woman interjected coldly, "by people with the appropriate clearance and the emotional fortitude for the work. Your work here is done, Doctor. You should be proud of your contribution." Contribution? They were taking my life's work, my discovery, my catastrophe, and they were going to twist it into something monstrous, They were going to weaponize it. The thought was so horrifying I felt dizzy. I saw where this was going. They would try to replicate my experiment. They would try to control that thing. They would poke and prod it, thinking they could tame it, turn it into a tool. The arrogance, the sheer, suicidal arrogance. I was escorted from the infirmary to one of the black helicopters. Eris was already inside, sitting silently, staring at the floor. They put us in, strapped us down, and the helicopter lifted off, leaving the Haarp facility behind. I looked down at the forest of antennas, my creation, now in the hands of men who would use it for purposes I couldn't bear to imagine. I realized then what I had built. I hadn't built a telephone to the stars. I hadn't built a scientific instrument. I had built a church steeple, a massive, powerful spire designed to attract the attention of something ancient and vast and slumbering. I had rung the bell and called down a god, or a devil. It didn't matter which. And now, I was leaving the church in the hands of inquisitors who thought they could chain it to their will. The flight back to civilization was silent. Eris and I didn't speak a word. There was nothing left to say. We were debriefed again at a secure facility at Elmendorf Air Force Base. We signed the papers. They were thick, full of legal jargon and veiled threats about national security, espionage, and lifelong imprisonment. We were given our new assignments. Eris was sent to a university in Germany to study solar winds. I was given a desk job at the Pentagon, analyzing foreign satellite capabilities. They were burying us, scattering us to the winds, erasing our connection to what we had done. The official story held. Haarp went back to being the boring weather project. The news reported a minor incident related to a solar flare. The world moved on. But I couldn't. I had looked into the eye of the storm. I had felt its consciousness wash over me. And I knew they hadn't covered it up. They had just put a lid on a volcano. And they were standing on top of it, thinking they were in control, poking it with a stick to see if they could make it erupt on command. They are so wrong. You can't control something like that. You can't weaponize a force of nature. All you can do is annoy it. And we had annoyed it very much. The silence they imposed on me lasted for 25 years. But I'm an old man now. I have nothing left to lose. And I've heard whispers, rumors on the fringes of the internet, talk of new, strange experiments happening up there in Gakona. They're getting arrogant again. They're forgetting the lesson we learned that night. And someone has to warn them. Someone has to tell the world what is really sleeping in our sky. The years after Gakona were a long, gray twilight. I lived my life in a state of carefully managed paranoia. The desk job at the Pentagon was a gilded cage, a place where they could watch me. I analyzed my satellite data, wrote my reports, and went to my meetings. I played the part of the dutiful, unremarkable government scientist, but I was always listening, always watching. I avoided forming close relationships. How could I, when the most significant event of my life was a secret I could never share? How do you explain to someone why you sometimes wake up screaming in the middle of the night? Not from a nightmare, but from the memory of a color. How do you describe the lingering phantom feeling of that cosmic soul-crushing terror? It never truly went away. It was like a form of psychic tinnitus. Most of the time it was just a low hum in the background of my thoughts. But sometimes, on quiet nights, or when I looked up at a clear, star-filled sky, it would surge, a faint echo of that dreadful alien consciousness, a reminder that it was still up there, waiting, watching. I was a ghost at my own desk. My colleagues saw a quiet, competent, but ultimately uninspired analyst. They had no idea that I was the man who had spoken to the sky. They didn't know that the quiet man in the corner who was so good at analyzing signal interference had once commanded a machine that could make the ionosphere sing. The government's silence was absolute. My former team members were ghosts too. I tried to find them once, in the early years. I looked for Eris Thorn. The university in Germany had no record of him. I searched academic databases, personnel records. It was as if he had vanished from the face of the earth. The others were the same, wiped clean. New names, new lives, or maybe no lives at all. The thought was a cold stone in my gut. Was I the only one left? The only one who remembered? This recording? My decision to make this? It wasn't a sudden one. It was a slow burn. A pressure that has been building for over 2 decades. The catalyst was a small article I found buried on page 17 of an obscure physics journal about a year ago. It was written by a young, ambitious scientist from the University of Alaska. It was about anomalous, highly structured auroral events observed near Gekona. The paper described geometric light patterns, perfect squares, concentric circles, complex fractal-like shapes appearing in the aurora for brief, fleeting moments. The young scientist attributed them to a new theory of magneto-ionic resonance. I knew what he was seeing. They were doing it again. Maybe they'd lost my original research for the resonance key. Maybe they were trying to rediscover it. Or maybe, and this was the thought that truly chilled me, maybe they had found a way to refine it. They were poking the Titan again, and the Titan was starting to stir in its sleep. That's when I knew my silence was no longer protecting anyone. It was enabling them. It was allowing a new generation of arrogant, ambitious men to walk down the same path I had, blind to the cliff edge just ahead of them. So I began to prepare. I retired from my job. I moved to this small, isolated house in rural Maine, a place with no close neighbors, a place where I could be alone with my memories. I spent months writing everything down, dredging up every detail from the cold storage of my memory. The feel of the Arctic air, the hum of the capacitors, the look on Eris's face, the exact shade of that impossible purple in the sky. I needed to get it all out, to create a record that they couldn't erase. This testimony is my final report, my last log entry. I'm not doing this for fame or revenge. I'm doing it because I have a responsibility. I was the one who knocked on that door. I have to be the one to warn people about what's on the other side. They'll probably come for me after this is released. The Men in Black, or their modern equivalent. It doesn't matter. I'm an old man. My story is told. But the danger isn't to me. It's to all of us. You have to understand, the consciousness in the ionosphere, it's not evil. Not in the way we understand evil. A volcano is not evil. A tsunami is not evil. They are simply powerful, indifferent forces. This thing, it's the same. It exists on a scale we cannot comprehend. Our existence is less than a blink of an eye to it. Our thoughts, our logic, our attempts at communication, they are an irritation. A meaningless, high-pitched squeal in its ancient silence. And the men now running Haarp, the new generation of Major Davises, they think they can control that. They think they can turn that irritation into a weapon, to aim that cosmic annoyance at their enemies. They believe they can build a better cage for their chained god. They don't realize the fundamental truth that I learned in 93 seconds of perfect terror. You can't chain a god, and if you keep rattling its cage, eventually it will break the bars. And the fury it will unleash will not be a targeted weapon. It will be a storm that scours the entire planet clean. That's the truth of Haarp. That's the secret they have been guarding for a quarter of a century. We didn't build a research station. We built an altar for a cosmic horror. And the high priests now in charge are about to make their final, fatal sacrifice. And they're going to sacrifice all of us along with them. Let me take you back to the control room, to the moment just before we sent the prime number sequence. I need you to feel the hubris. I need you to understand the blindness that led us to that precipice. The room was cold, but we were all sweating under the fluorescent lights. The energy was palpable, a mix of profound excitement and a deep, gnawing anxiety. It was the feeling of standing on the edge of history. I was at the main console, my fingers flying across the keyboard, running the final diagnostic on the transmission protocol. Every pulse had to be perfect. The timing, the frequency, the amplitude. It was the most complex piece of signal engineering I had ever attempted. Aris stood behind me, a silent, disapproving shadow. He had made his final plea an hour earlier. "Elias, just one more week," he had urged. "Let's run more simulations. Let's try to model the potential for a non-linear emotional response." I had waved him off. Emotional response. Aris, it's a plasma field. It doesn't have emotions. It has physical properties. We're sending it the purest, most logical signal conceivable. It will either understand, or it won't. There is no middle ground. Oh, how wrong I was. There was a middle ground, and it was hell. The young technicians were like kids on Christmas morning. They were triple-checking their systems, their faces glowing in the light of their monitors. They were about to be part of the first contact with a non-human intelligence. They were thinking about Nobel Prizes and history books. They weren't thinking about the nature of the thing they were about to prod. Even Major Davis, usually so stoic, had a glimmer of something in his eyes. Not excitement, predatory anticipation. He was a hunter who had cornered a magnificent, unknown beast, and he was about to see if it was as powerful as he hoped. He saw a weapon. I saw a discovery. The technician saw glory. Aris saw a dark, unknown abyss. We were all looking at the same thing, but we were seeing 4 completely different realities. 5 minutes to transmission, Sarah announced, her voice crisp and professional over the room's intercom. I took a sip of my cold, bitter coffee. I looked at the main screen, at the visualization of the antenna array, 180 silent crosses waiting for my command. I felt like a conductor about to lead an orchestra in a symphony for an audience of 1. A single, planetary-sized listener. I felt a surge of pride. This was my theory, my design, my moment. The arrogance of it looking back is suffocating. I believed, with all my scientific certainty, that I had accounted for every variable. I had models for signal reflection, for energy absorption, for harmonic resonance. I had a model for everything except the one thing that mattered, the consciousness itself. I treated it like a problem in physics, not a problem in psychology, a colossal failure of imagination. 1 minute, Sarah's voice cut through my thoughts. I put on my headset, cutting out the ambient noise of the room. All I could hear now was the faint, steady hiss of the receiver and my own breathing. I placed my hand on the final activation key. It was a small, red, protected button under a clear plastic cover. A theatrical touch, insisted upon by Davis, to add a sense of finality to the act. It was the trigger. I looked over at Aris one last time. He met my gaze and he just shook his head. A slow, sad gesture of defeat. He knew he couldn't stop me. He knew we were already falling. "Transmission sequence initiated," I said into my microphone. My voice was steady. I flipped up the plastic cover. The red button glowed. "Mark." A technician started the countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Mark. I pressed the button. The transmission began. The first lonely pulse, representing the number 1. The 2 pulses for 2. The 3 for 3. On the screen, a small green light blinked for each pulse, a visual confirmation that our message was on its way. It was a quiet, sterile, almost anticlimactic moment. A series of blips being sent into the sky. No one could have predicted the reply. The first sign that something was wrong was a sound. A low, deep hum that wasn't coming from the equipment. It was coming from the building itself. The concrete floor began to vibrate, a deep, resonant thrum that you could feel in your teeth. It was the same sound we had heard when we sent the Bach concerto, the sound of celestial annoyance, but this time it was 100 times more powerful. Then the lights flickered. Once, twice. The battery backup systems kicked in with a loud clunk, and then the wave hit. It wasn't just terror. It was a complex, layered assault on the senses and the soul. First came the dread, the absolute certainty of non-existence. But it was followed by a wave of pure, unadulterated confusion. Imagine every thought you've ever had, every memory, every sensation being thrown into a blender and pured into a meaningless, screaming chaos. My own name lost its meaning. The faces of my colleagues became unfamiliar patterns of flesh. The room itself seemed to warp and twist, the laws of perspective dissolving. The angles were wrong. That's what the technician was muttering about. The angles. Our human brains are built on Euclidean geometry. We live in a world of straight lines and predictable curves. The consciousness we had contacted did not. It thought in fractal dimensions, in non-Euclidean spaces. And for 93 seconds, it forced our minds to perceive reality as it did. It was a glimpse into the mind of a god, and it was a mind of pure, chaotic, geometric madness. It was this cognitive dissonance, this forced perception of an impossible reality that caused the screaming. It was the brain's last, desperate defense against a reality it could not process. The final layer of the attack was the most insidious. It was a feeling of being known, completely, intimately. I felt the entity's awareness sweep through me, through my memories, my thoughts, my deepest fears. It saw my pride, it saw my ambition, it saw my dismissal of Urus's warnings, and I felt, in that terrible, intimate moment, a feeling of pure, cold contempt directed at me. It knew I was the one who had designed the annoying noise, and it was punishing me for my arrogance. When it was over, I was left with more than just fear. I was left with a profound sense of shame. I had been weighed, I had been measured, and I had been found wanting. A primitive, arrogant child playing with forces he could not begin to comprehend. That is the memory that truly haunts me. Not just the fear, but the shame of that cosmic rebuke. The immediate aftermath was a landscape of broken minds. For nearly an hour, the control room was a sanatorium. No one spoke. The only sounds were the humming of the servers, the quiet weeping of a technician, and the rhythmic, nonsensical muttering of the man under the desk. I was moving in a fog, my own mind feeling bruised and raw. My first instinct was to check the data, to try and find a scientific explanation for the madness we had just endured. I stumbled over to a terminal, my hands still shaking, and brought up the sensor logs from the past 10 minutes. The screens were a riot of impossible data. The magnetometers had recorded fluctuations so wild they should have been impossible outside the core of a star. The spectrum analyzers showed a flood of frequencies across the entire electromagnetic spectrum, from deep ALF waves to high-energy gamma rays. It was a data storm, a complete sensory overload for our instruments, just as it had been for our minds. It was not a signal, it was a tantrum. A massive, planet-sized burst of pure, chaotic energy. A scream of rage and pain. "Shut it down," Eris said. His voice was quiet but firm. He had recovered faster than the rest of us. His fear had been vindicated, and in that vindication he found a strange, grim strength. "Shut all of it down, Elias. De-energize the array. Kill the power to the transmitters. Now." He was right. We were exposed, vulnerable. We didn't know if another wave was coming. I gave the order. Sarah, her face still pale and tear-streaked, typed the commands with the trembling fingers. We watched as the power levels on the main display dropped to 0. The deep, resonant hum that had become a part of our lives for so many months faded away, leaving a dead, unnerving silence. We had hung up the phone, but we knew the entity on the other end was still there. We were just a group of frightened scientists, alone in a concrete box in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness, with a wounded, angry god looming over us. It was then that Major Davis began to stir. He pushed himself up, his eyes wild. He wasn't looking at us. He was looking at the silent, dark screens. "Get it back online," he ordered, his voice a ragged bark. "What was the peak energy output? I need numbers. I need data." "Major, the team is in no condition," Eris started to say. "I don't give a damn about their condition," Davis roared, his military composure shattering completely. He staggered over to Eris, grabbing the front of his lab coat. "Don't you understand what just happened here? This is it. This is the Holy Grail. A non-lethal weapon that can incapacitate an entire command center. It can win a war without firing a single shot. We have to control it. We have to replicate it." The sheer, naked ambition in his eyes was more terrifying than the memory of the wave. He hadn't seen a cosmic horror. He had seen a product demonstration. He saw a beautiful, terrible new sword, and all he wanted to do was figure out how to build his own. "You can't control it," I said, my voice barely audible. "It's not a machine, Davis. It's something else. We annoyed it. If we try to do that again, it might do more than just scare us." "That's a risk I'm willing to take, Doctor," he sneered, letting go of Eris. He turned to me. "Your job, from this moment forward, is to figure out exactly what we did and how to do it again, on command. You will write a full report." That's when the red phone rang, the call from his superiors, the call that sealed our fate and began the cover-up. While he was on the phone, turning our shared trauma into a sanitized lie about a solar flare, I made a decision. I couldn't let him have it. I couldn't let the Pentagon have this power. While everyone's attention was on Davis, I moved to a secondary data terminal in the corner of the room. My heart was pounding in my chest. I knew I had only seconds. I logged in with my master administrator credentials. I brought up the directory for the raw data logs from the last hour, the recording of the prime number transmission, the sensor data from the reply, the crown jewels, the key to replicating the event. With a few keystrokes, I created a compressed, encrypted archive of the entire event. Then I transferred it to a small, encrypted, solid-state drive I kept hidden in my wallet for emergencies. The transfer took 17 seconds. It was the longest 17 seconds of my life. As soon as the transfer was complete, I initiated a secure erase protocol on the source files, a military-grade wipe, overwriting the data with random noise 7 times. By the time Davis hung up the phone and turned to face us with his new orders, the most important data from the most significant event in human history was gone. Wiped clean from the Haarp servers, it existed in only one place in the entire world, on the small black chip of plastic and silicon hidden in my pocket. Davis never knew. In the chaos of the takeover, they swept the systems, but they were looking for copies. They never suspected that the original data had been deleted entirely. They assumed it was there, buried in the terabytes of other recordings. They spent years trying to find it, trying to replicate what we did, but they couldn't, because they didn't have the key. They didn't have the exact, intricate waveform of my resonance key, or the precise timing of the prime number sequence. They only had the sanitized, incomplete report I was later forced to write. I had committed an act of treason to prevent a greater catastrophe. I had stolen the fire from the gods, not to give it to humanity, but to hide it away from the men who would use it to burn the world down. It was my only act of defiance, my only victory in a war I had already lost. And that small, encrypted drive has been my burden and my secret ever since. The debriefing, the real one, took place a week later, in a place with no name. It was a windowless room, deep inside a secure facility somewhere in the Virginia countryside. The walls were a neutral gray. The table was cold, sterile steel. On one side, me. On the other, the gaunt man from the helicopter and the woman in the gray suit. There was no tape recorder this time, no pretense of creating an official record. This was about containment. "We have reviewed your preliminary report, Dr. Vance," the woman began, her voice flat. "It is incomplete." I wrote down everything I could remember. I lied. My heart was a cold, heavy lump in my chest. "Let's talk about the resonance key," the man said, his dead eyes fixed on me. "Your report describes the general theory, but it lacks the specific modulation sequences, the exact frequencies, the timing. We need the source code, Doctor." This was it. The moment I had been dreading. They knew something was missing. The source files were corrupted during the event, I said, my voice amazingly steady. "The energy surge wiped the local drives where the transmission protocol was stored." It was a plausible lie, and they almost bought it. The woman leaned forward slightly. "Dr. Vance, we are not unreasonable people. We understand that what you experienced was traumatic, but we need you to understand the gravity of this situation. What you discovered is of the utmost importance to national security. It is a paradigm-shifting technology. We need to be able to control it. To do that, we need your help. We need you to reconstruct the sequence." "I can't," I said, shaking my head. "It wasn't just a simple code. It was a complex, intuitive process, a mix of mathematics and art. I spent months developing it. I couldn't just write it down again from memory. It's gone." The gaunt man sighed, a soft, weary sound. He reached into a briefcase beside him and pulled out a single, black and white photograph. He slid it across the table to me. It was a picture of a man's face. He was smiling, but his eyes were filled with a familiar, hollow terror. It was Eris Thorne. "Dr. Thorne has been uncooperative," the man said softly. "He insists that the project should be buried, that the technology is too dangerous. He seems to be under the impression that he has a choice in the matter." The threat was unspoken, but it hung in the air like a thick, choking smoke. "Help us, or your friend will suffer the consequences." They thought Aris was my weakness. They were wrong. Aris was my strength. I knew what he would want me to do. He would want me to hold the line. "I'm sorry," I said, pushing the photograph back across the table. "I can't help you. The data is gone." The man stared at me for a long time, his expression unreadable. I could see him weighing his options. He could torture me. He could threaten my family. But he also knew that a sequence created under duress, a sequence created by a broken mind, would be useless. It had to be perfect, and he knew he couldn't force perfection. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Very well, Doctor," he said. He stood up. "As we said, your work on this project is concluded. We have a new position for you at the Pentagon. You will be comfortable. You will be monitored. You will live out a quiet, peaceful life, but you will be silent. If you ever speak of this to anyone, Dr. Thorne's situation will become significantly more cooperative. Do we have an understanding?" I looked him in the eye. "You have my silence," I said. It was the only card I had left to play. My silence in exchange for Eris's life. I had no idea if they would honor the deal, but it was all I could do. The final revelation didn't come from them. It came from me, in that moment of terrible clarity. The real horror wasn't what was in the sky. The real horror was right here, in this room. It was the calm, bureaucratic, and utterly ruthless ambition of my own species. The entity in the ionosphere was a force of nature. It was vast, ancient, and indifferent. It had lashed out because we had heard it. But these people, they were different. They had felt that same power, that same terrifying force, and their only thought had been, how can I use this against other people? They wanted to bottle the storm. They wanted to take that weapon of pure existential terror and aim it. They weren't trying to contain a monster. They were trying to train it. My final desperate act was not to destroy the data. My final act was the lie I was telling right now. My sacrifice wasn't my career or my freedom. It was my truth. I was condemning humanity to ignorance about the greatest discovery in its history. I was doing it to protect humanity from itself. As they led me out of the room, I felt a strange sense of peace. I had failed as a scientist. I had unleashed a terror upon my friends. But in this final moment, I had succeeded in my duty as a human being. I had taken the key to a weapon that could end the world as we know it, and I had buried it in a lie. I walked out into the Virginia sunshine, a free man who would spend the rest of his life in a prison of silence, carrying a secret that was both a terrible burden and a sacred trust. And so, I began my new life. A life in the gray, silent world of secrets. The Pentagon was a labyrinth of beige corridors and anonymous offices, a perfect place to disappear. I became a ghost, a name on a door, a man who kept to himself. The years passed, the world changed, the Soviet Union fell, the internet rose, wars were fought, and peace was declared. And through it all, I held my silence. I kept my promise. I never tried to contact Eris. I prayed that my silence had brought his safety. I grew old. The sharp edges of the memory began to dull, but the weight of it never lessened. It was a constant presence, the secret I carried. It was there in the quiet moments, in the dead of night, when the house was still. Sometimes I would go outside and look up at the sky, at the vast, silent canvas of stars, and I would wonder, was it still aware of us? Did it remember the brief, irritating pinprick of our transmission? Or had we been so insignificant that it had already forgotten? I hoped for the latter. The fear was that they hadn't forgotten, that the men in charge of Haarp, with their limitless budgets and their relentless ambition, would eventually stumble upon the right combination of frequencies, that they would manage to recreate my resonance key without my help, that they would knock on that door again, and this time, the entity's reply might not be a warning. It might be a final, definitive answer. Which brings me to now, to this room, to this microphone. I am breaking my promise. I am breaking my 25 years of silence, because I know they will come for me. My life is forfeit the moment this recording goes public, but I am an old man, and my life is a small price to pay. I am doing this because I owe it to Eris, wherever he is. I owe it to the young technicians whose minds were shattered that night, and I owe it to all of you. To the people who live and dream and look up at the sky, never knowing what is sleeping there. They told me that what I experienced was a hallucination. They created a comfortable lie to shield themselves from an uncomfortable truth. But I was there. I felt it. And I am telling you, with the last ounce of conviction I have in my soul, that we are not alone. But the intelligence we have found is not our friend. It is not our enemy. It is simply other. And it is a power that we, as a species, are not ready to wield. They gave me a new name, a new life, and they told me to forget. But I can't. Because sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the world is asleep, I can still hear the static on an open radio channel, a faint, rhythmic hiss. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to the bone, it's still listening, So, that's the story of Dr. Elias Vance. A story about how the ambition to create the ultimate telephone resulted in a lifelong vow of silence, haunted by the memory of a dial tone that could shatter a soul. Officially, Project Aeneas never existed. It was just a solar flare. But after hearing this, you and I know the truth. They didn't stop listening. They just got a new set of headphones. Thank you for watching until the very end. If this story made you think or look over your shoulder, support the channel with a like and subscribe. Your engagement helps these forgotten stories find the light. And be sure to share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, be careful what you shout into the dark. You never know who or what might be listening.